Welcome back, everyone. I am so thrilled to be your academic coach today for this AMCI explainer. Today, we are going to completely demystify ICD-10-CM guideline A.11. That's the fundamental guideline covering inclusion terms. My goal is to make sure you truly understand this concept, not just to memorize it, but to really master it so you can assign your codes with total accuracy, full confidence, and absolutely zero test day panic. Let's get started. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our quick roadmap for today. We're going to cover welcome to inclusion terms, defining them, NEC codes and their application, the non-exhaustive rule, avoiding those common pitfalls, and finally, coding the AMCI way.
All right, Section 1, welcome to inclusion terms and their real-world utility.
You know, in the fast-paced world of medical coding, second-guessing yourself is just a massive time sink. Your absolute best shield against denied claims and all that uncertainty is asking yourself this one exact question. What specific conditions can be assigned to this code? I mean, when you're staring at the tabular list, how do you actually know if the diagnosis in the provider's documentation really belongs there? Well, inclusion terms are your answer. They're basically these essential tools that confirm the highly specific clinical language in your medical records directly corresponds to the code you're getting ready to bill.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining inclusion terms, specifically what they are and exactly where they're located.
So, before we can actually use these terms to solve our coding problems, we really need to know what they are and precisely where they live. Basically, inclusion terms are lists of acceptable conditions found under specific codes in the tabular list. And let's make sure this is crystal clear, because in coding, location is literally everything. These lists are located strictly at the code level. You're not going to find inclusion terms hanging out way up at the broader three-character category level. Nope, they are nestled right under the fully formed specific codes to definitively tell you, yes, this condition belongs right here. And you know, very often, these terms act as just simple synonyms. For example, let's say a provider documents renal failure, but the official ICD-10-CM code title actually says kidney failure. Well, inclusion terms step in to bridge that gap for you. They show you related terminology that represents the exact same clinical condition. This totally confirms you're in the right place, even if the doctor's wording varies just a little bit from the standard code description. By linking those real-world clinical synonyms to the standardized codes, the manual is honestly doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you. All right, Section 3, NEC codes and application. Let's look at the how. So now that we know what they are, how do we actually apply them? Well, when you're dealing with NEC, or not elsewhere classifiable codes, which the tabular list calls other specified codes, and as you know, often end in a .8 or .9, inclusion terms play just a massive role here. Think about it like this. Let's say a provider documents a highly specific strain of acute bacterial bronchitis, right? But the ICD-10-CM system simply doesn't have a unique, dedicated code just for that specific strain. So the system directs you to an other specified code. The inclusion terms listed under these other codes provide a really safe catch-all grouping for these highly specific but technically unclassified conditions. They're basically saying to us, hey, we don't have a unique bucket for this, so it belongs right here in this shared bucket. Which brings us to Section 4, the non-exhaustive rule. This is the why. Okay, we have officially arrived at the absolute most critical and frankly, probably the most frequently misunderstood rule of this entire guideline. So, the crucial point is, the list is not complete. These lists of inclusion terms are non-exhaustive. I literally cannot stress this enough. Just because a condition isn't explicitly listed under a code in those inclusion terms, absolutely does not mean it can't be coded there. Think about it. The publishers simply cannot physically list every single possible variation, complication, or phrasing of a disease in one printed manual. It's just impossible. So other conditions may still perfectly apply to that code. If you don't see the exact wording in the tabular list inclusion terms, please do not panic and definitely do not assume you have the wrong code. You need to look to the alphabetic index. The index might point you right to that specific code, totally verifying your choice even if the specific synonym isn't listed directly under the code in the tabular section. You've got to trust the entire system, not just the single list sitting underneath the code. Moving to Section 5, avoiding common pitfalls. Let's do some myth busting. All right, let's put on our Mythbuster hats and systematically debunk the errors that constantly lead to reduced accuracy and miscoding opportunities. And this brilliantly illustrates our first big one, confusing inclusion terms with includes notes. Notice the difference here. Inclusion terms are found strictly at the code level. They apply specifically to the individual code you're evaluating to confirm acceptable conditions. Includes notes, on the other hand, map to the category level, that broader 3-character level. They provide definitions, clarifications, or examples for that entire broad family of codes. So whatever you do, never mix up the two.
Let's quickly review the major pitfalls you absolutely need to avoid out there. First, as we've heavily discussed, never think the list is complete. Second, do not ignore valid clinical conditions just because they happen to be unlisted. Third, failing to recognize when a documented term is just a straightforward synonym for the code title. And finally, over-relying on the inclusion terms list instead of doing a full code review with your documentation. I promise you, these traps will absolutely trip you up on your exams if you let them.
And finally, Section 6, Coding the AMCI Way. This is the climax of our explainer. All right, it's time to anchor everything we've just learned today. We're going to do that with a classic, memorable AMCI gem. Now, what's really interesting about this is how simply it breaks down a super complex guideline. Ready? Inclusion terms equals terms included but not limited. Really let that sink in. Included but not limited. They show you exactly what can be coded, but they are absolutely not a boundary wall meant to keep everything else out. Think of them as examples, not some exclusive VIP list. And right on the heels of that is your secondary MJ gem. This is your ultimate test when evaluating a code. If it fits the code, it can be coded. Do not let an incomplete list in the tabular manual talk you out of a code that accurately reflects the provider's specific, documented clinical diagnosis. Look, if the index brings you there, and the physiology and anatomy fit the definition, you code it. Simple as that. So, bringing it all together, what are our key takeaways for coding the AMCI way? First, always rigorously review the medical documentation. You have to let the provider's words be your foundation. Second, use your deep knowledge to confirm the condition actually fits the code. And finally, use inclusion terms exactly as they were intended as a helpful compass to confirm your choice, not as a strict limit that restricts your accuracy. I want to leave you all with one final question to think about. If a clearly documented condition perfectly fits a code, but it isn't specifically printed on the inclusion terms list, are you confident enough to code it anyway? Well, after today, you absolutely should be. Trust the guidelines, trust your knowledge, and always let the documentation lead you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep coding the AMCI way.